So I say a lot of the time that people shouldn't pat, scratch or rub the top of goats' heads because we don't want to teach them to butt. And I thought maybe that I should elaborate a little bit more on that and my thoughts regarding goat behavior and human interaction. Now, we get the stereotype all the time that goats butt people, and goats can, and some of them, plenty of them it seems, do butt people. The difference is that typically goats do not butt people unless they have learnt to butt people. A goat is a flight animal, not a fight animal. So if it's frightened or stressed or whatever, it will attempt to put distance between itself and the frightening or stressing object. They don't automatically, as a rule, turn around and start butting it. Butting is primarily in the goat world used for asserting dominance and ranking in the herd, sometimes fighting over food or the best position in a shelter, all that kind of thing. Now, people, when they see animals and go to interact with them, I've noticed that they typically seem to go for the face and the head of the animal. Part of that could be the human tendency to use the face, particularly amongst ourselves and human to human, to gauge how the other person is feeling, read their facial expressions, and gain context from the face and the expressions it makes on how the other person is feeling. And so that possibly plays a part in why a lot of people will automatically go to pat a goat on the top of the head. The other reason, I believe, is that a lot of people are very familiar with animals like dogs and cats. When we see a dog, we usually will go to pat said dog on the top of the head. A lot of dogs like being patted on the top of the head and will offer their head and expect someone to pat them there. Cats, additionally, seem to enjoy being patted on the top of the head. Some cats, that's the only place they like being patted. And so I think that there's a tendency to use the behavior we're familiar with for familiar animals. Most people are familiar with cats and dogs, and without even thinking about it, extend that behavior to other animal species that we may encounter. Now, we do often pat horses on the face, and people will pat cows on the face, although the cows will have the same, in some instances, reaction as the goats. And I think that we need to think about how these animals interact with each other. For instance, dogs and cats, if dogs are having a fight for position, it's the dog's teeth that are their main weapon. They'll be snarling, they'll be growling, snapping, and then they'll go in for it with their teeth. Cats, it's similar. There's claws come into it, but if a cat is having a serious fight, there's a lot of screeching and yowling and posturing with the fur up, but the main weapon is their bite. Goats are different in that their weapon is their actual head, and in particular the area from roughly the center of the eyes to the back of the skull or the poll. Now, when a goat is horned, naturally the horns are the focus of the combat zone. If you've got a goat that is naturally hornless, or in the case of the majority of my girls been disbudded, then even though the horns aren't there, that is still their primary zone as use as a weapon for asserting their dominance. Now, they also do have scent glands back there, and so particularly bucks, you might see rubbing their heads on things. One of my goats used to like to put the horse's electric tape at the back of the buds where the horns were removed, and she'd rub her head back and forth and scratch there. You often find that they get bits of detritus that's sort of stuck in those little creases just from the back of the head where the poll rounds over, and it feels nice to be scratched there. I mean, who doesn't like a nice head massage? However, in goat interactions in the herd, the only time I really see a goat using that area of the head to scratch on another goat, it's usually a dominant animal doing it to a subordinate. and she'll come up and she'll rub the back of her head up and down the other goat's neck on the underside. And usually the one that's being rubbed on doesn't look like she's enjoying it. It doesn't come across as a gesture of affection, more as a gesture of dominance. I'm the boss, just you remember that, and everything's good. One of my bucks, the Toggenburg, he gets harassed by Picton all the time. Picton will come up and he'll rub his head up and down the Toggy's neck, and the Toggy will walk off a few steps and Picton will walk after him and rub him again. It's clearly, in the buck's case, not an affectionate gesture. It's an annoying, poking, prodding sort of thing that he does because he's boss of applaud. Picton is boss. And if he's not doing that, he's trying to ride him, which is another way of asserting dominance and just putting the other fella down. So I don't really feel that scratching the back of a goat's head in goat-to-goat interactions is done against another goat as a affectionate way of reinforcing herd bonds or anything like that. It's far more of asserting, in my opinion, based on what I've observed, the ranking and the position in the herd. Now, temperament, of course, plays a huge part in whether a goat has a strong tendency or not to become a headbutter. Samira, for instance, is a very placid, laid-back temperament around people, except when there's food. She can get very snatchy with food. She'll hook her nose over your arm and yank you over and snatch a bucket out of your hands. But when she wants to have attention, she'll just come and stand there, and if you put your arms around her and scratch her shoulders or anything like that, she loves it. She laps it up. I wouldn't go so far as to say you could never teach her to butt, because I try to avoid ultimatums with goats because they love to make liars of you. Basically, the only time I'll say an absolute is that there is absolutely no absolutes, if that makes sense. Goats will break the rules when you least expect it. So I wouldn't say it's impossible to teach her to butt. I would say that it would take a lot longer and you'd need to be a lot more, I suppose, hassling her and mishandling her to have her use her head in a traditional butting way. Kalia, on the other hand, she's quite nice-tempered. She's not really a big bully in the herd, but she's what I call heady. So when you're patting her, actually she does it, if you watch while I'm patting her face, she rolls her head down, lowers her head, and then she rolls it up. And if you notice, she's managing to roll it so that my hand is on the top of her head, like she wants me to interact with her there. Now, she's one that I think you would very easily teach to have a poor reaction to people if she was encouraged in this. And part of the reason for that is that Kalia didn't really start doing this until one day when we had a visitor who was talking to Mum, who was milking, and Kalia was in her spot. And this person was just reached out, and Kalia was saying, "Oh, hello, who are you? What are you doing? Do you have food? Whatever." And this person just reached out and, like you would a dog, was interacting with her and patting the top of her head. And when Mum looked up, I don't know whether it was a minute or two later, she noticed that Kalia's body language had changed. She had her ears up, she had her tail up, and she was assuming the type of stance you see from a goat that's thinking of challenging another goat for a position or because of some insult that is perceived by the other goat. And she was starting to lean and tilt her head as if she was thinking about offering to fight. And Mum said, I think she probably would have taken it further if she hadn't said, "Oh, you probably shouldn't pat the top of her head." I have currently 4 Saanens. For some reason, it's just the Saanens. It could be, as I said, sometimes you have temperament play into it, and temperament can be sometimes a bit hereditary, like when you're breeding, sometimes you breed for temperament. Most of our Saanens tend to be related through a dam line or a sire line. it's not necessarily close, but there's usually ways to link the relations there, because we've been breeding them now for quite a few years. And I have 4 that I would term heady. In other words, they will rub their heads on you, or it seemed to offer you to scratch them on the head. 3 of them, I know for a fact, have had people pat them on the top of the head or scratch them on the top of the head. Adorabelle and Grace, when we were working on the TV drama set, the cast and the crew particularly would come over because they thought, the goats were really cool. It was a bit of a novelty having them there, and so they would pat them and they would bring them treats and things like that. Now, that's fine, except that they would sometimes pat them on the top of the head, and Grace in particular really enjoyed having the top of her head scratched. And so now if I go to pat her, she actually will turn her head sideways and swing it, hoping to rub it against me, and she can actually crack me with it, and it can actually hurt quite a bit. She's not actually trying to butt because she hasn't got her head down, she hasn't got that frontal position happening, but she's obsessed with having the top of her head rubbed. Now, Adorabelle has it, but not quite to the same extent. Kalia was handled by people when they came to see the goats, and she came up and we noticed that her and one other son, and who's no longer here, were getting patted on the top of the head. And I've noticed that now if I have people in the paddocks, Grace and Kalia will come up and they have a different way of approaching. They sort of got their ears up and their tail up, and this almost dominant look about their posture and their body language, like they're thinking about challenging this person's right to be in their paddock and saying, well, you need to appease me, give me a scratch or whatever, because I'm a bit of a boss around here. I don't particularly like that in my goats. One in the past that started this way actually started cracking people with her head. She also got handled on the top of the head by others, not me. With me, she was an absolute gem. She never put a foot wrong. But she got very aggro against others. She'd try to bite them when they walked past. She did hit a couple of people, and she'd walk up to them with that same attitude in her posture. And so I'd prefer it if Kalia and Grace didn't develop this behaviour further. The other one is Golden, who is actually Grace's daughter. I don't know for sure if people have patted her on the head. She's quite friendly, so it's possible that at some point when we had people that wanted to see the goats, she got a bit of a scratch. But she's in her own personality, a very bossy goat in the herd. She bullies all of the ones that are her own age, and she'll make rude noises at them, bite them, bash them. Even some of the older does won't walk past Golden because she flogs them. And so that could be part of the reason why she's much more likely to be heady. When she comes up and you look at her, she immediately tries to rub her head on you. And I'm very keen for her to not develop that into a habit, because, as I said, even if she doesn't take it any further, the rubbing can get quite rough, and if she swings it with a lot of gusto like Grace sometimes does, and it's not in a nasty way, but it can still hurt, and so I would much prefer if they didn't do that. My other does, particularly the coloureds, I don't seem to have that same issue. They're completely different family lines, and like I said, I think that can play a part of it. Now, head rubbing in that zone, I think, is really not a thing that goats do primarily for affection. I'm not saying that when a goat offers its head to be scratched, it's automatically going to be mean. But in their own interactions in the herd, it doesn't tend to be something that they do to their buddies, like the ones that they cuddle up with and sleep with. They'll lay their head on them, they'll rest their head on them, and lean on them, all that kind of stuff, but they don't go and rub the backs of their heads on them. So I avoid playing with that area. I mean, when I was a little kid, and I knew the goats liked it, and I'd scratch their heads, and some of them, they'd roll their eyes and act like it was really nice, but then you'd get some that would just, that's all they wanted. That was the only interaction they wanted. Scratch my head or, I'm going to get grumpy. So I don't do that anymore, and I discourage animals like Grace from swinging their heads to rub them against me. It's like, no. I'll pat you, and I'll pat you on your shoulders, which are also itchy, and you like having your shoulders scratched, you like having your spine scratched, you like having your rump scratched, all that kind of thing. But I'm not going to encourage you with this head scratching business, because that area of the head is their primary combat zone, and that tends to be what it's primarily used for. And if you watch them when they're actually starting to think about having a fight, that's the part they present to each other. It's the part they actually contact on. And so, personally, for me, it's just not worth the risk, of possibly encouraging a negative behavior. Even if it's, in the case of Grace, not trying to be nasty, just rough and pushy about it. And so I don't play with that part of the head. There's plenty of other areas on the goat that I can scratch, that they like being touched on, and doesn't run the risk of the goat becoming heady or eventually to the point where it actually might start to be bossy and use its head against people. And that's same as you don't ever push the goat on the top of the head either, because when you actually push it, that is full on suggesting that you want to contend with it, because you don't push against each other in the goat world with the top of your head unless you're trying to assert yourself. So you don't ever push on the top of the goat's head, and sometimes these pats can potentially be misinterpreted by the goat as a bit of a push. So that's just my thoughts on it, and it's basically, what I feel from observing the animals with their own interactions and a bit of their, I suppose you could call it, thought processes. I'm not a scientist or anything like that, and I don't claim to be 100% right, but this is just stuff that I've observed over the years, and trying to put some of that into words and make my position understandable.